Okay, so we're moving on now to the philosophy of Tom Regan. Regan is an animal rights ethicist, and what he'll be arguing for is granting animals moral rights. Keep in mind that when we talk about moral rights, we are not talking about giving animals legal protections or legal privileges like the right to vote. We're just saying that animals have the right to be treated a certain way or not to be harmed, perhaps, because they have moral standing. That's the basic idea behind the idea of moral rights. So here's Tom Regan. He is a contemporary ethicist around today, and he has three goals, he says, in this text, and they're going to seem pretty outlandish and far-fetched to a lot of readers at the outset, but he's going to walk us through an argument that supports these three goals. The first is the abolition of using animals in science. So he thinks that we should never use an animal in an experiment where we wouldn't also use a human being. The dissolution of commercial animal agriculture, this is sometimes called factory farming, basically raising animals and manipulating what they're fed and their living environment in such a way to mass produce meat, eggs, milk, all that good stuff. And then eliminating all hunting and trapping of animals as well. So what this will leave us with is a pretty limited amount of things that we can use animals for as resources. And the reason for that is that he is opposed to using any animal that has certain qualities as a resource that's at our disposal. And he thinks that we ought to use animals, or view animals rather, instead as entities with moral standing that have certain moral rights. So he's basing his argument on the idea that animals have inherent value. This is a concept that we talked about before. It was first introduced when we were looking at ethical theories. And we talked about, when we were covering Kant, the idea of human beings having inherent value. And what we meant by that was that they're valuable for their own sake and not for the use or the purpose that they serve for another person. That was why Kant said we're never to use other people as a mere means to an end. Regan's got a similar stance here on animals based on the notion that they have inherent value. So beings with inherent value, he says, cannot be used as a mere resource for others. So if we agree that another thing, a human being or an animal, is valuable for its own sake, that means we can't just use it to get what we want or as a resource with things like eggs or milk that we want to harvest. He says the fundamental problem is that we view animals in this way. We view them as resources that exist for our wants instead of as having any inherent value or being valuable for their own sake. So he's going to consider a few previous approaches to animal ethics that have been pretty commonly put forth by different philosophers over time, and he's going to reject them all in favor of his own approach. So this is a pretty standard way that a lot of ethicists put forth their own ideas, as they entertain all the negatives of past approaches, and then they propose their own solution, which doesn't have any of those drawbacks. And of course, in Regan's view, his own view has some very strong strengths as well. So he's going to look at Kant's view of indirect duties, the idea of contractarianism, the cruelty kindness view, as he calls it, and then the utilitarian approach. So I'm going to go over all of these in more detail. This is just a preview slide to tell you where we're going from here. First, let's look at Kant's view, the view of indirect duties. This says that we only have duties to other human beings because other human beings are rational and autonomous. So to remind you again of that second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, what he says there is that we are to use all human beings as ends in themselves and never as a mere means to an end. And the reason behind Kant's second formulation is that human beings have rationality and autonomy, and it would be a very bad thing to manipulate another person and coerce them, deceive them in some way that took away their rationality and autonomy. So this is the standard Kantian view. So in this sense, because animals are not rational and autonomous in the sense that Kant finds valuable, Kant thinks that you have to be able to reason, you have to use logic to think through a dilemma, and you have to act autonomously. He said that we don't have any duties directly to animals. In other words, if I see my neighbor out walking her dog, I don't have any duty to that animal not to harm him. So I shouldn't harm my animal out of the duty I have to my neighbor, not out of any duty I have to that dog. So the idea here is that out of respect for my neighbor and her property, I shouldn't harm her animal. But I don't have a duty to the animal itself because it isn't rational and autonomous. So the argument here is that animals can't feel pain and suffering, and that only human pain and suffering is morally relevant. So in Kant's time, remember Kant lived quite a long time ago, a few centuries ago, the idea at that time was that animals were not capable of feeling pain and suffering in the same way that human beings were. So it really wasn't a very big deal if you did something that might be harmful to a human being, to an animal, because the idea was that you weren't actually causing any animal suffering. So Regan is going to reject Kant's view based on the current knowledge that we have that animals, at least many of them, can experience pain and suffering. So there's no rational reason to dismiss the pain and suffering of animals as irrelevant if we are to take that into account when we consider human beings. Contractarianism is Regan's term for social contract theory. This is a theory that we saw with Thomas Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes was about how and why we ought to form a social contract. So in contractarianism, we have the idea that we only have moral duties to other people within our mutually agreed upon arrangements. So when we're thinking about Hobbes, remember Hobbes said that we want to leave the state of nature. It's not a good place to be. And we do that by creating mutual agreements with other people to limit our behavior in some way. And I only have obligations to the other people who have made that agreement with me. If there's anyone who's outside of that agreement, outside of my social contract, I don't have to abide by those rules because we haven't made that agreement. So that's the basics of contractarianism, and we wouldn't have any duties to people outside of our social contract. So this argument would say that because animals are not capable of making social contracts, they don't have any rights in our society and we don't have any duties towards them. So an animal would have to magically develop the ability not just to use a tool to avoid getting their nose scratched, but to make and understand a social contract, which we know that no animal that we're aware of can do that. Regan also doesn't like this view. He says we don't apply the same mode of reasoning to people. And here he's going back to the issue of marginal cases from the first video. He says that there are plenty of human beings who can't understand contracts. Infants, young children, people with disabilities, people at the end of life who have lost their rational abilities. There are lots of human beings who don't have the ability to understand contracts, and yet we treat them as if they can, and we extend rights to them anyway. So he's going to reject the idea that a mutual agreement has to exist that everybody can understand in order for us to talk about rights and duties. Thirdly, he looks at what he calls the cruelty-kindness view. This is a pretty straightforward idea that we should be nice and not mean, basically. We have a duty to be kind to animals and to avoid cruelty to them. So this is very appealing because it's not nearly as complicated as a lot of the other ideas that we're talking about. However, Regan thinks that it's really poorly articulated and it's not very well thought out once we delve into it a little bit further. So he's going to reject this view because there's really not sufficient ethical justification for that. And what he's bringing up here is something that we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester when we looked at the difference between etiquette and ethics. And what Regan wants to point out here is that being nice isn't always the same thing as behaving ethically. If you think back to the example of the two roommates who, one of whom was about to go out looking really bad and the other roommate told a white lie and said, "Oh, you look good," trying to be nice, right? But we also saw that that might not have been the ethical thing for her to do. So acting kindly isn't the same thing as behaving ethically. And you can have someone who's generally a kind person. Regan uses the example of the kind racist, who does not in fact behave ethically because they discriminate against other people. And then if we avoid cruelty, that doesn't necessarily mean we're acting ethically. So if you think about instances in which you avoid harming somebody, but maybe you're not actually doing the right thing either, that's what he's talking about here. So the cruelty-kindness view is basically so unreflective and so unsophisticated that it's not going to be a good ethical guide for us. Okay, so the fourth and last theory that Regan is going to consider and then reject before putting forth his own theory is the utilitarian view. So I already previewed this for you when we were talking about utilitarianism. I mentioned that sentience, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, is the main criterion for utilitarians about who ought to be in or out of the moral community. So in utilitarianism, the suffering of all beings is of moral concern, and all suffering is to be considered equally. So remember, we have that equality principle in utilitarianism that says everyone's happiness, or in this case, everyone's pain or suffering, is equally important. And we're required to consider what Regan calls the aggregated consequences. In other words, the happiness of all involved, not just yourself. he's also going to reject this idea. And he rejects it based on the idea that utilitarianism as a theory in general doesn't give enough attention to the idea of inherent value. So we already know that Regan's going to place a lot of emphasis on this idea of inherent value. And what he doesn't like about utilitarianism is something very similar to what we talked about when we initially put forth the theory, which is that it turns us all into generators of happiness for other people. And that's our only value, really, in utilitarianism, how much use you are to creating the most good for the greatest number. So it would sometimes allow us to harm one person for the greater good. And he gives the example of his grumpy old Aunt Bee on page 332, which is a great illustration of this. So Regan's going to put forth his own view, and he thinks this proposal has none of the weaknesses of these four views that he rejects, and in fact has some major strengths as well. So the problem is with these other views, is not going to be encountered in Regan's rights-based view. It's not subject to the flaws of these other approaches. It doesn't allow us to discriminate. It doesn't allow us to exploit other people for the greater good. And it recognizes the inherent value of animals and people. So these are all great strengths according to Regan of his own viewpoint. So what he wants to do is think about on what basis we can really claim that rights ought only to be given to human beings and not to animals. So this is the standard support for this idea, that human beings have abilities that animals don't. He's going to reject that. We already saw with our discussion of marginal cases that that's not always true. Some people would argue on religious grounds that human beings have souls, but animals do not. Since we can't prove this, this is basically a conjecture statement, right? This isn't something that we can demonstrate to be true. So he's going to reject that as well. And then he's also going to reject the idea that we should only care about members of the species Homo sapiens. He says this is an arbitrary distinction. Species membership isn't very relevant for him. So the basis for rights for both humans and animals is this idea of being what he calls the experiencing subject of a life. He says on page 334 that we are each of us the experiencing subject of a life, a conscious creature having an individual welfare that has importance to us, regardless of whether we're useful to other people. So let's look at what we were required again for being what he calls the experiencing subject of a life. We have to be conscious, and we have to care about our own welfare, and have certain things, interests, in other words, to go back to the last video, that we want to pursue. So this is a pretty different standard than the ability to reason and be autonomous, and it's going to include a lot of non-human animals. And if you have that, if you have these basic qualities of having interest and having consciousness, he's going to say you possess inherent value. And for him, inherent value is equal value. So it's basically an absolute concept. Having inherent value, I don't have a little bit more than someone else. You either have it or you don't. So it's a pretty black and white issue for him. So all beings with inherent value are of equal value and have an equal right to be treated with respect. This doesn't, again, mean exactly equal treatment because what my interests are going to differ from what another being's interests are. So it means paying attention to the interests of that individual, not treating everyone exactly the same all the time. So Regan understands, to go back to his three goals that he stated at the beginning, that there are some important implications of his view, things that would follow from accepting his ideas. First, we would have to eliminate all laboratory research involving animals. This is a primary example for him of using them as our resources without taking any consideration at all of their inherent value. We would not be able to farm animals for food. Again, killing another thing to eat it does not respect its inherent value. And we wouldn't be able even to allow animals to roam wild and then trap or hunt them when we needed their resources. And the reason for that is it doesn't matter to him how good an animal's life is up until the point that it is killed for food or taken for its pelt or whatever it may be. What matters is that we're using that animal as a mere resource when we do that. Okay, so that's it on Regan. What you're going to see next is Mary Ann Warren's rebuttal of Regan, and take into account as you think about this, the issues that we talked about in the intro, and how you want to work your own opinion into these evaluations.